The Old Testament reading today comes from the book of Proverbs, chapter 27, verse 17. Iron sharpens iron, and one person sharpens the wits of another.
Well, our second reading today is from the Gospel according to St. Luke, and it's a story about an experience that Jesus and his disciples encountered while they were traveling through a region called Samaria in ancient Palestine. We read beginning in chapter 9, verse 51. When the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. And he sent messengers ahead of him. On their way, they entered a village of the Samaritans to make ready for him. But they did not receive him, because his face was set toward Jerusalem. When his disciples James and John saw it, they said, "Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them?" But he turned and rebuked them. Then they went on to another village. May God add his blessing to the reading of his holy word. Let's pause for a moment of prayer. Oh God, we give you thanks today that we have breath to draw to worship you. We thank you for every moment that you've given us on this earth. It is a gift. We thank you for the people that you surround us with, not only so that we can be blessed by them, but so that we can be a blessing to them. And we thank you for every opportunity you give us to learn your wisdom and your holy word that helps us in this task. Bless us today as we seek you during this difficult time in our world's history that we're journeying through. Give us strength, give us courage, and make us stronger and more faithful disciples of you than we were heading into this challenge. We ask you these things in Christ's name. Amen. Well, a group of American friends took a trip across Europe. This, of course, was before the pandemic. And when they arrived in France, they decided to attend church on Sunday in a small town. Now, none of these guys understood French, but they looked forward to the chance to just be in and experience French worship. Throughout the service, the group of men, they followed the lead of other members in the congregation as they stood and kneeled and sat at various points. But at one point, the pastor stepped forward, and he said something in French, and the man sitting next to them, he stood up, so they all stood up as well. But as soon as they stood up, to their surprise, the entire congregation broke out in laughter. Well, these guys didn't know what had happened. So after the service, the men approached the pastor and they said, "Pastor, we're just wondering, what was so funny when we stood up?" Well, the French pastor, who also spoke English, he said, "Well, I announced a birth in the congregation, and I asked the father to stand." Well, there are barriers in this world between people, barriers like language that separate people from each other. But God can help us build bridges that close the gap between human barriers, regardless of what they are. Regardless of what stands in the way, be it culture, gender, age, race, ideology, or even infectious diseases. God, regardless of what separates us, can help us connect with others in meaningful ways that we might have thought weren't possible. And God can help us work in those situations so that God's miracles flow through those connections into everybody's lives. But here's the thing about all of this. We have to be willing to do something ourselves for God to be able to build those bridges, which is to demonstrate love to others in 3 specific ways. We need to be willing to be vulnerable with others. That's a risk, but we need to be willing to be vulnerable. We need to be willing to be honest with others. And thirdly, we need to be willing to be respectful of others. Vulnerable, honest, and respect. It doesn't matter what it is that's separating people from each other. Love that is demonstrated through vulnerability, honesty, and respect, that will help us build bridges. Now, at some point, those 3 ways of expressing love need to be shared reciprocally by everybody involved in the relationship. It can't, of course, just be all one way indefinitely. But if we're willing to be the first to try, God can work through that to help us be a part of amazing relationships that we thought might never have existed, and bring healing into situations that we thought wasn't possible. And I bring this up because we see this very dynamic taking place in our gospel reading today. In fact, Jesus demonstrates it through his actions. See, in our passage, Jesus and his disciples, they arrive at a village whose residents don't want to have anything to do with them. But though Jesus' disciples are convinced that this barrier can't be overcome, that doesn't stop Jesus from trying. This passage appears in the Gospel of Luke shortly after Jesus has spent some one-on-one time, you could call it, with his 12 closest disciples in a remote region north of the Sea of Galilee. He often traveled to these remote areas to mentor his disciples and prepare them to carry on his ministry after his death. And our Lord emerges from this retreat, if you will, with his disciples, this time away, with the determination to head to Jerusalem to confront the dysfunction that was taking place there, right in the heart of Judaism, and to sacrifice his life for the world while doing so. And to get there, as a practical matter, Jesus decides to take the shortest route, which is through a large region called Samaria. It was a Roman province in his day that was large enough when you were traveling on foot that Jesus and his disciples would have needed to seek lodging at some point in a Samaritan town. Now, this shouldn't have been a problem. Because, as I've mentioned many times before, hospitality, it was a cherished universal virtue in most ancient cultures. And that was for very practical reasons. See, in the ancient world, there were no roadside motels, no Super 8s or Motel 6s, where people could stop into for the night. There weren't any Cracker Barrel restaurants off the exits that they could swing into for a bite to eat after a long day on the road. Ancient travelers, They didn't show up at the entrance of town riding in air-conditioned cars with a cooler full of snacks in the back seat. No, they showed up on foot, oftentimes hot, tired, and hungry, dehydrated, and sometimes, quite frankly, almost dead. So it didn't matter who showed up at your front door. If he wasn't wielding a pickaxe with malintentions, there was a universal social covenant that you give the guy a bite to eat and let him sleep somewhere on your property. I mean, stick him in the shed if you have to, but give him some place to sleep. Otherwise, it would have been impossible for most people to travel any significant distance in the ancient world. So, it really shouldn't, from a cultural standpoint, have been a problem for Jesus and his disciples to find a place to crash for a few hours somewhere in Samaritan territory. But in our story today, we read that when Jesus sends messengers ahead of him into a village to find a room, which should have been a no-brainer, the Samaritans did not receive him because his face was set toward Jerusalem. Now, what in the world does that mean? Well, these Samaritans refused to offer Jesus and his disciples hospitality because Jesus and his disciples were Jewish, and there had been a long period of hostility between Jews and Samaritans. Remember that 800 years earlier, the formerly United Kingdom of Israel that stretched all the way from the region of Galilee in the north down into the area north of the Sinai region, it was broken apart. It fell apart. Now, this happened for a variety of reasons, in part because the king at the time was a ruthless buffoon, but it also had to do with cultural and ethnic differences between Israelites who lived in parts of the north and those who lived in the south. Differences that acted as barriers that made it difficult for people in the north to relate to people in the south. And after the kingdom officially fell apart, the people in these regions, they still, of course, didn't get along. They still continued to fight with each other across the new political border that they had developed. See, there are far too many people who think that the best solution to every problem in the world is a political one. If we can just force the right policy or right political party into power, then we can make genuine, lasting changes to people and their lives. But as the French soldier and statesman Charles de Gaulle once said, I love this quote, "Politics is too serious a matter to be left to politicians." Politicians aren't the answer to our problems. Politics, political agendas, they're simply tools that help people whose hearts have already changed for the better, to make positive changes in their society. And that is just as true today as it was in Jesus' society, in the ancient world. 800 years before Jesus was born, the politics of ancient Israel may have changed between the north and the south, but the Samaritans and the Jews, in their hearts, still hated each other. And they found ways to regularly stick it to each other when they got the chance. Ancient sources tell us that one of the ways some of the Samaritans did this was to harass vulnerable Jewish pilgrims traveling through Samaria to attend religious festivals in Jerusalem. Jews from Galilee who were elderly, sick, or physically challenged in some way. They had to take the route through Samaria to Jerusalem because it was the shortest, most direct route. But they'd get jerked around the entire trip by certain Samaritans. And the Jews were just as nasty in their own ways to the Samaritans. And Jesus had had it with all this garbage. He was tired of it. He grew up seeing it. He experienced it. He was tired of it. So he decided on his way to Jerusalem to save the world through his death and resurrection. He decided to take the route through Samaria himself so he could try to change things. See, being a Jew, Jesus knew it wouldn't be a pleasant trip through Samaria. But quite frankly, Jesus didn't care. He wanted to build a bridge across the chasm separating Jews and Samaritans. And by traveling through Samaria the way he did, he demonstrated love in the first way that's necessary to build bridges that build relationships. He was willing to be vulnerable with the Samaritans. He was willing to put himself out there and say, here I am. I know what you're going to say about me. Go ahead and say it. I still love you. I'm willing to be vulnerable before you. Now, Jesus' disciples obviously didn't understand this, because we read in verse 54 that James and John, they respond to the Samaritan's rebuke saying, Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them? It makes you wonder what James and John were thinking. Jesus, the man who calmed the stormy sea, who healed people who were afflicted with life-threatening diseases. They're asking him to call down fire upon somebody. But that was the extent of the hatred between the Jews and the Samaritans. Instead of doing that, Jesus, he then demonstrated love in the second way necessary to build relationship. He was honest with his disciples and the Samaritans. We read in verse 55, Jesus right there in the middle of Samaria turned and rebuked them, his own followers. That was his own team. These were the people on his side, right? But yet he was honest with them about how he felt about their actions, which were rotten. For nearly 1,000 years, Jews and Samaritans, generations of people, they'd been huddling together on their own separate sides against each other, willing to overlook what some on their own side might do that they disagreed with for that larger good of having this power base to accomplish what they wanted to accomplish. For 1,000 years they did this, and where did it get them? Nowhere. Now, I'm sure every single one of the insults that people and each opposing group flung at each other over the years felt good in the moment for the people doing it. But in the end, it accomplished nothing. It was a ginormous waste of time. Jesus instead stood apart from the members of his own group because he wanted to build a bridge and actually get somewhere. So he was honest with his followers in front of the Samaritans, rebuking his followers, even if that left him standing apart from the support of his own crowd. And then Jesus takes the last step necessary to build bridges across barriers between people. He showed the Samaritans respect. We read in verse 55 that he and the disciples went on to another village. So Jesus respected the wishes of the Samaritans in that village who weren't ready to receive him at that moment. But he also demonstrated respect for the Samaritans overall by not giving up on them. He was willing to continue to make himself vulnerable. He was willing to continue to be honest. He was willing to continue to reach out and give to another group in the area, who went on to another Samaritan village, the text tells us, where he presumably could give the residents of that community the same opportunity, the chance to respond favorably to his vulnerability, his honesty, and his respect for them, so that the two groups of people who had accomplished nothing together for so long by opposing each other could transform their collective world for the better by beginning to build bridges between each other, so that the impossible could become, by the grace of God, possible. And the same thing is true in our lives if we follow Jesus' example. It's true every time we follow his example. See, just as in Jesus' day there are cultural, there are ideological, there are racial, there are political, and other kinds of barriers that separate people from each other. But every time that we, with God's help, are willing to be the first to demonstrate love through that vulnerability, through that honesty, and through that respect for others, we give God the materials to build bridges through which God can work in miraculous ways. So this passage really challenges each of us to ask ourselves, am I willing to give God the chance to work through me in these ways, to build bridges across barriers that separate me from others? Amen.